There were moments in Earth's history when life almost ended. Oceans turned poisonous, the sky filled with ash, sunlight faded long enough to break entire food chains, entire ecosystems collapsed at once, not slowly, not gradually, but all at the same time. In the worst of these events, nearly everything died. Up to 95% of all species disappeared. The oceans emptied. Ancient life that had survived for millions of years vanished in what, in geological terms, was almost an instant. And it did not happen just once. It happened again and again. Each time, the planet reset. Complex life was stripped away. Entire branches of evolution were erased. Speed did not matter. Strength did not matter. Even intelligence was not enough. But something remained. A creature so simple, it doesn't think the way we do. No planning, no learning as we understand it, no visible effort to adapt or improve. It did not become more advanced. It did not need to. While everything else disappeared, it continued, almost unchanged. And that leaves us with a question that is difficult to ignore. If intelligence could not guarantee survival during the worst moments in Earth's history, then what actually could? In tonight's story, we follow the quiet survival of one of the oldest animals on Earth, the horseshoe crab, a creature with no brain, no strategy, and almost no need to change, yet one that has outlived nearly everything else. Just before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank our Patreon members. Your support truly makes videos like this possible, and it means more than you might realize. And if you enjoy these stories and would like to support the channel as well, you can find the link in the pinned comment. Let's begin our story. Extinction is often imagined as something gradual, a quiet fading that takes place over stretches of time, too vast to fully grasp, where one species disappears while countless others continue without interruption. In most moments of Earth's history, this is true. Species emerge, persist for a time, and eventually vanish, leaving only faint traces in stone. These ordinary losses form a slow background rhythm, a continuous reshaping of life that rarely disturbs the balance of the whole. A mass extinction moves differently. It does not follow the gentle pace of natural turnover, nor does it remain confined to isolated branches of life. Instead, it unfolds as a rapid global collapse of biodiversity, where a significant portion of living species disappears within a relatively brief geological interval. What would normally take millions of years becomes compressed into a far shorter span, sometimes only thousands, altering the trajectory of life across the entire planet. The distinction lies not only in scale, but in intensity and reach. A typical extinction might affect a single lineage or a localized ecosystem, while a mass extinction cuts across oceans and continents alike, disrupting nearly every environment at once. The systems that support life begin to fail in overlapping ways, creating conditions where survival becomes increasingly rare, not because of competition, but because the foundations themselves are no longer stable. Across deep time, five such events stand apart, often referred to as the Big Five. Each one marks a boundary in Earth's history, a moment when life was reduced dramatically before slowly rebuilding in new forms. These events are not remembered through memory or observation, but through the layered archive beneath our feet. In ancient sediments, scientists find abrupt shifts in fossil presence, where once abundant organisms vanish suddenly from the record. Chemical signatures within these layers reveal changes in oxygen levels, temperature, and ocean chemistry, forming a quiet but consistent pattern that signals a global crisis. The oceans, in particular, carry the clearest imprint of these events. Marine environments support a vast portion of Earth's biodiversity, and their stability depends on delicate balances of oxygen, temperature, and nutrient flow. When these balances shift, the effects spread quickly through entire food webs. Layers of sediment record intervals where oxygen levels dropped so low that large regions of the sea floor became inhospitable, leaving behind darkened deposits that speak to a time when life struggled to persist. These changes do not always unfold at the same pace. Some mass extinctions appear to occur in pulses, stretching across millions of years, with repeated waves of decline. Others strike more abruptly, compressing devastation into a much shorter window. In either case, the defining feature remains the same: a rapid and widespread loss that reshapes the planet's biological landscape. What follows is not an immediate recovery, but a long, uneven return. The survivors, often few and scattered, become the foundation for entirely new ecosystems. From this reduced beginning, life slowly diversifies again, taking forms that differ from what came before. The world does not simply restore itself, it transforms, carrying forward only fragments of its previous identity as it settles into a new balance, shaped by what endured. Long before familiar forms began to take shape, the surface of Earth moved through conditions that would feel almost unrecognizable. Now, a world still unsettled, still finding its balance, where land, sea, and sky interacted in ways that allowed only the simplest forms of life to persist. The planet's crust shifted beneath restless forces, volcanoes released vast plumes into the atmosphere, and the chemistry of the oceans changed slowly, then suddenly, then slowly again, as if testing what could endure. Life existed here, but it did not resemble anything complex or visible at a glance. It remained microscopic, composed of single celled organisms drifting in water or clinging to surfaces where conditions allowed stability for brief stretches of time. These early life forms relied on chemical processes that required no oxygen, drawing energy from compounds dissolved in their surroundings, forming quiet communities that left behind only subtle traces in layered stone. Oxygen itself, which now sustains most complex organisms, was once a disruptive presence. When certain microorganisms began releasing it as a byproduct of their metabolism, it accumulated gradually in the oceans and atmosphere, altering conditions in ways that proved harmful to many existing forms of life. What would later become essential was, at this stage, a force of imbalance, reshaping ecosystems at the smallest scales. Entire populations declined as this new element spread, while others adapted slowly, finding ways to tolerate or even use it. Within the oceans, where much of this transformation unfolded, life continued to experiment with new arrangements. Cells began to cooperate, forming simple clusters that moved and functioned as a unit rather than as isolated individuals. These early steps toward multicellularity did not appear suddenly or uniformly. They emerged in scattered instances, often fragile and temporary, dissolving when conditions shifted beyond narrow limits. Still, over immense spans of time, these arrangements became more stable, allowing for slight specialization among cells, and the first hints of structured bodies. The oceans provided a kind of shelter for this gradual development. Water moderated temperature, dissolved essential compounds, and softened environmental extremes that would have been more severe on land. Within this fluid space, early life could persist through fluctuations that might otherwise have ended its progress. Even so, stability remained relative rather than absolute. Changes in temperature, chemistry, or nutrient availability could ripple quickly through these simple systems, altering the conditions that sustained them. These early ecosystems were delicate, not because they lacked resilience, but because their complexity had not yet developed enough to buffer against disruption. Each organism depended closely on specific conditions, and the networks connecting them were shallow, with few layers to absorb shock. A shift in chemical balance could cascade through entire communities, reducing them or reshaping them into new configurations. Recovery was possible, but it unfolded slowly, guided by the same gradual processes that had built these systems in the first place. Over time, what began as scattered microscopic life expanded in diversity and interaction, forming the quiet foundation upon which all later complexity would rise. The path forward was not driven by sudden leaps, but by accumulation, each small change settling into place, holding if conditions allowed, fading if they did not. In this early world, life learned to persist within limits, shaping itself around the boundaries set by an environment that had not yet settled into permanence. For a long stretch of time, life advanced in increments so small they seemed almost indistinguishable from stillness, each change settling quietly into place before another followed. Then, around 540 million years ago, the pace shifted. The record preserved in ancient rock layers begins to fill with forms that had no clear precedent, as if a threshold had been crossed and the possibilities of life expanded all at once into visible diversity. This interval, often called the Cambrian explosion, did not unfold as a sudden flash, but compared to the slow rhythms that came before, it appears remarkably rapid. Within a span of tens of millions of years, organisms developed structured bodies with defined shapes, symmetry, and internal organization. Harder parts, such as shells and exoskeletons, began to appear, leaving behind clearer impressions in the fossil record, allowing these forms to persist as detailed imprints long after the organisms themselves had vanished. The emergence of complex body plans marked a quiet turning point. Instead of loosely arranged cells or simple clusters, organisms now exhibited specialized structures, segments that served distinct roles, and surfaces that interacted with their surroundings in more deliberate ways. Movement became more controlled, orientation more defined, and the boundary between organism and environment more pronounced. These developments did not replace earlier forms of life, but layered over them, adding new dimensions to ecosystems that were once relatively simple. Among the groups that flourished during this time were early arthropods, whose segmented bodies and jointed appendages allowed for a wide range of motion and interaction. Their forms proved adaptable across different marine settings, from shallow seafloors to open water. The structural efficiency of their exoskeletons provided both protection and support, creating a balance between flexibility and durability that would persist through countless generations. As these organisms diversified, interactions between them began to change as well. The appearance of predation introduced a new dynamic, where survival depended not only on enduring environmental conditions, but also on responding to other living beings. Some species developed defensive features, thicker shells or spines, while others evolved ways to detect and pursue movement. These relationships did not arise all at once, but gradually intertwined, forming the early threads of ecological networks that would grow more intricate over time. Within this expanding landscape of forms, the distant ancestors of horseshoe crabs made their first appearance. Their basic structure, already recognizable in outline, reflected a design suited to life along the seafloor, where stability and efficiency mattered more than speed or complexity. They moved within environments shaped by shifting sediments and gentle currents, occupying a space that required consistency rather than constant adaptation. The Cambrian seas held a diversity that had not existed before, yet this diversity did not emerge from chaos. It followed patterns shaped by physical constraints, environmental opportunities, and the gradual accumulation of biological innovations. Each new form carried traces of what came before, even as it explored new possibilities in structure and behavior. What had once been a world defined by simplicity now supported a broader range of life, layered in ways that allowed interactions to deepen and expand. The pace of change remained tied to the same underlying processes, but the outcomes became more varied, more visible, and more enduring. From this point forward, the story of life would carry a different texture, shaped not only by survival, but by the unfolding complexity that had begun to take hold. A cooling began, not as a sudden shift, but as a steady withdrawal of warmth that altered the balance of the planet in quiet, accumulating steps. Over time, vast ice sheets expanded across southern landmasses, locking away enormous volumes of water. As this ice grew, the oceans responded by retreating from the margins of continents, exposing broad stretches of seafloor that had once been submerged beneath shallow, life filled waters. These coastal regions had supported dense communities where organisms lived within narrow ranges of depth, temperature, and light. As sea levels dropped, these habitats diminished, compressing entire ecosystems into shrinking spaces before removing them entirely. The transformation was not chaotic in appearance, yet its consequences moved through the living world with steady finality. Conditions that had remained stable for long intervals shifted beyond the limits that many species could tolerate. The cooling extended into the oceans themselves, altering circulation patterns and the distribution of dissolved gases. In some regions, waters became less hospitable as temperature changes affected oxygen availability and nutrient flow. Organisms that had evolved within relatively stable marine environments found themselves unable to adjust quickly enough. Their specialized structures, once suited to consistent conditions, offered little flexibility as the environment narrowed around them. This period, known as the Ordovician extinction, stands as the first of the great global disruptions recorded in Earth's history. Fossil layers from this time reveal an abrupt decline in biodiversity, where entire groups of marine organisms disappear between one layer of sediment and the next. The loss was extensive, affecting an estimated 85% of species, most of them inhabiting the oceans that had once provided a stable foundation for life. Unlike earlier changes that unfolded gradually, this event carried a sense of compression, where environmental stress accumulated faster than biological adaptation could respond. The interplay between falling sea levels and shifting ocean chemistry created overlapping pressures, each reinforcing the other. Habitats contracted, resources became limited, and the interconnected networks that supported life began to unravel. Yet within this broad collapse, not all forms were equally vulnerable. Some organisms, particularly those with simpler requirements or greater tolerance for variation, persisted through the changing conditions. Among these were early relatives of horseshoe crabs, whose presence in the fossil record continues beyond this boundary. Their survival does not stand out through dramatic adaptation, but through a kind of steady compatibility with environments that others could no longer endure. These organisms occupied spaces less dependent on narrow conditions, often closer to shifting shorelines or within sediments where fluctuations were already part of daily existence. Their way of living, shaped by interaction with changing surfaces and variable waters, aligned more closely with the altered world that emerged as the extinction progressed. While more specialized species declined, these forms remained, continuing their quiet movement along the edges of a transformed ocean. As the glaciation eventually receded and ice began to release its hold, sea levels rose once more, returning water to the continental margins. New habitats formed over landscapes that had briefly stood exposed, and life began, slowly, to expand again into these spaces. The world that followed carried fewer lineages, but it also held the seeds of new arrangements, shaped by those that had endured the contraction and persisted through its narrowing path. In the long aftermath that follows a collapse, the world does not return all at once, nor does it restore what was lost in familiar shapes. Instead, recovery begins in scattered pockets, where small groups of survivors persist in conditions that have begun, slowly, to soften. Time stretches here, measured not in brief cycles but in vast intervals, as life rebuilds itself from what remains rather than what once was. The earliest stages of this renewal are sparse. Organisms that endured the previous disruption begin to expand outward, occupying spaces that have been left open. These environments, once crowded with layered interactions, now feel reduced, quieter in structure, with fewer connections linking one form of life to another. The absence of former complexity creates room, but also uncertainty, as new relationships form gradually, guided by trial rather than stability. Over millions of years, these scattered beginnings develop into more defined ecosystems. Communities begin to take shape again, though they differ from those that existed before. The balance between species is altered, influenced by which lineages survived and which disappeared entirely. Some groups, once dominant, never return, while others that had been minor or unnoticed begin to spread, filling roles that were left vacant. Evolution continues within this shifting landscape, but it does not move evenly across all forms. Certain lineages diversify rapidly, adapting to the new conditions with variations that allow them to explore a wider range of environments. Others remain limited, either constrained by their structure or unable to adjust to the altered chemistry and climate that now define the planet. The pace of change varies, creating a patchwork of life where some areas become rich with diversity, while others remain relatively simple. As these ecosystems mature, the traits that support survival begin to shift in importance. Where once complexity may have provided advantages in stable conditions, the aftermath of disruption favors different qualities. Flexibility becomes more valuable than specialization, and the ability to endure a range of conditions begins to outweigh the benefits of highly refined adaptations. Organisms that can tolerate variation in temperature, oxygen levels, or resource availability find themselves better suited to a world that has not yet settled into consistency. This does not mean that complexity disappears, but rather that it reemerges along new paths, shaped by the constraints imposed by the recent collapse. Some forms grow intricate again, building layered systems of interaction, while others maintain simpler structures that allow them to persist without reliance on narrow conditions. The direction of evolution remains open, guided by the interplay between opportunity and limitation. Within this gradual rebuilding, a quiet sorting takes place. Lineages that align with the new environment expand and diversify, while those that cannot adapt slowly diminish. Extinction continues even after the major event has passed, not as a sudden wave, but as a lingering process that refines the emerging ecosystems. Over time, the world fills again with life, though its composition reflects a different balance than before. What emerges from this long recovery is not a restoration, but a transformation. The patterns of life shift, carrying forward only fragments of earlier systems, arranged into new configurations that reflect both loss and persistence. The survivors do not simply rebuild what was, they become the foundation of what follows, shaping a world that continues forward, altered yet continuous in its unfolding. It does not arrive as a single moment marked by a sharp boundary, but as a prolonged unraveling, where decline settles in gradually and lingers across vast stretches of time. The Devonian collapse unfolds in intervals, each one weakening the structure of life a little further, until what once seemed stable begins to fragment under pressures that do not fully recede. Between these intervals, there are brief pauses, yet the overall direction remains unchanged, a drawn out descent rather than a sudden fall. Within the oceans, the changes take on a quieter but far reaching form. Oxygen levels begin to drop in expanding regions, a condition known as anoxia, where waters that once supported active ecosystems become increasingly depleted. This shift does not occur uniformly. Pockets of low oxygen spread unevenly, sometimes retreating, sometimes advancing, creating unstable boundaries where life must either adapt to scarcity or withdraw entirely. For organisms dependent on steady oxygen levels, these conditions narrow the space in which they can survive. Reef systems, which had grown into complex and layered environments, begin to fade during this period. These structures, built over long spans of time by organisms working in quiet accumulation, depend on consistent chemical and environmental conditions. As the balance shifts, their growth slows, then stops, and in many regions, reefs disappear altogether. With their decline, the intricate habitats they supported also vanish, removing entire networks of interaction that had once been anchored in place. Fish lineages, which had diversified into a wide range of forms, experience significant losses as these changes persist. Some groups, adapted to specific depths or conditions, find themselves unable to adjust as their environments shift. Others decline more gradually, their numbers reduced over successive intervals of stress. The disappearance of these lineages alters the structure of marine ecosystems, leaving fewer forms to occupy the roles they once held. The collapse extends through multiple pulses, each one reinforcing the effects of the last. Changes in climate, fluctuations in sea levels, and alterations in nutrient cycles combine in ways that prevent a stable recovery from taking hold. Instead of a single disruptive force, it is the accumulation of pressures that defines this period, a layering of difficulties that together reshape the living world. Amid this prolonged decline, certain organisms continue to persist, not because they dominate, but because they remain aligned with the changing conditions. Early relatives of horseshoe crabs are among those that endure, their presence carried through layers that record the disappearance of many others. Their way of life, shaped by interaction with shifting environments, allows them to navigate the gradual loss of stability without requiring rapid transformation. These survivors do not halt the broader decline, nor do they stand apart from it. They exist within it, moving through conditions that have become more variable and less predictable. Their persistence reflects a compatibility with environments that fluctuate over time, where consistency is no longer guaranteed and adaptation must occur within limits that are constantly shifting. As the Devonian period draws toward its end, the cumulative effect of these collapses leaves the oceans altered in composition and structure. The richness that once defined many marine environments is reduced, replaced by systems that must rebuild from what remains. Life continues, but it carries the imprint of a long and uneven decline, shaped not by a single event, but by a sequence of changes that gradually reshaped the course of evolution. Across repeated disturbances, a pattern begins to emerge, not immediately visible within any single event, but gradually revealed as life passes through cycles of pressure and recovery. Certain forms persist across these intervals with a quiet consistency, while others, once abundant, fail to return. The difference is not always rooted in strength or complexity, but in how each organism relates to change itself. Some species are built around precision. Their structures, behaviors, and internal systems align closely with specific conditions, allowing them to thrive when those conditions remain stable. These are often referred to as specialists, organisms that excel within narrow ranges of temperature, chemistry, or available resources. In steady environments, this refinement provides an advantage, allowing for efficient use of energy and a close fit with the surrounding ecosystem. Yet when conditions begin to shift, the same precision becomes a constraint, limiting the ability to adjust beyond those boundaries. Alongside them exist generalists, forms of life that operate within broader margins. Their requirements are less exact, their interactions more flexible, allowing them to occupy a wider range of environments. They may not dominate any single niche with the same efficiency as specialists, but they carry a capacity to persist when conditions move beyond the familiar. This difference becomes more pronounced during periods of repeated stress, where survival depends less on optimization and more on tolerance. Diet plays a subtle role in this distinction. Organisms that rely on a narrow set of food sources find themselves vulnerable when those sources diminish or disappear. In contrast, those capable of shifting between available resources maintain continuity even as ecosystems rearrange. This flexibility does not require rapid transformation, but rather an existing capacity to draw from multiple options, reducing dependence on any single pathway. Habitat follows a similar pattern. Species confined to specific environmental conditions face increasing pressure as those conditions fluctuate or contract. Others, able to move between depths, substrates, or temperature ranges, navigate these changes with greater stability. Their presence extends across boundaries that might otherwise limit survival, allowing them to remain within the evolving landscape rather than being excluded from it. Metabolism, often unnoticed in outward form, contributes quietly to this resilience. Organisms with slower metabolic rates require less energy to sustain themselves, enabling them to endure periods of scarcity with reduced strain. In environments where resources become unpredictable, this efficiency provides a form of endurance, allowing life to continue through intervals that might otherwise lead to decline. Rather than racing to match changing conditions, these forms persist by maintaining a steady internal balance. Within this broader pattern, early horseshoe crab lineages begin to reflect many of these traits. Their way of life does not depend on narrow conditions or rapid change, but on a consistent interaction with environments that already contain variation. They move through substrates that shift with currents, encounter resources that vary in availability, and maintain internal processes that do not demand constant abundance. These qualities align with a world where stability is not guaranteed, allowing them to persist across multiple cycles of disruption. Resilience, in this sense, is not a single adaptation, but a combination of traits that together create a capacity for continuity. It emerges gradually, shaped by repeated exposure to changing conditions, and becomes visible only when viewed across long spans of time. Within these spans, survival is guided less by dominance and more by the ability to remain steady and adaptable as the world continues to shift around it. Far to the north of an ancient supercontinent, the ground began to open in ways that would not close for an immense stretch of time. From these fractures, vast volumes of molten rock poured outward, spreading across the surface in repeated flows that layered over one another, building a landscape of darkened stone. These eruptions, known today as the Siberian Traps, did not occur as a single outburst, but as a prolonged sequence, releasing gases and heat into the atmosphere with a persistence that gradually altered the balance of the planet. As these emissions accumulated, the air itself began to change. Carbon dioxide levels rose, drawing warmth into the climate, while other gases interacted with moisture to form compounds that settled back to the surface. The effects extended beyond the land, reaching into the oceans where much of life was concentrated. Water chemistry shifted as increased carbon dioxide dissolved into the seas, leading to acidification that made it difficult for many organisms to maintain their structures. At the same time, oxygen levels within the oceans began to decline. Circulation patterns altered under changing temperatures, reducing the movement of oxygen rich waters into deeper regions. In these expanding zones, conditions grew increasingly depleted, creating environments where many forms of marine life could no longer function. The combination of acidification and low oxygen formed a layered pressure, affecting organisms both at the surface and along the seafloor. This period, known as the Permian extinction, stands as the most extensive loss of life recorded in Earth's history. Fossil evidence reveals a dramatic reduction in biodiversity, with up to 95% of marine species disappearing across this boundary. Entire groups that had persisted for long intervals vanish completely, leaving no direct continuation into the ecosystems that follow. The scale of this loss reshapes the biological structure of the planet in a way that surpasses all previous events. The collapse does not unfold as a single moment, but as a sustained interval during which multiple stressors interact. Rising temperatures place strain on organisms already challenged by changing chemistry, while reduced oxygen limits the capacity for survival across wide regions. Food webs weaken as key species decline, and the interdependence that once supported complex ecosystems begins to unravel. Each layer of pressure reinforces the others, narrowing the conditions under which life can persist. Dominant species, once well adapted to stable environments, find themselves unable to adjust within the pace of these changes. Their specialized traits, effective under consistent conditions, offer little flexibility as the surrounding systems shift. As they decline, the ecosystems they supported lose structure, leading to further instability. The disappearance of these forms marks a transition not only in biodiversity, but in the very architecture of life across the planet. In the oceans, where the impact is most severe, vast regions become inhospitable, limiting the spaces where life can continue. What remains is unevenly distributed, concentrated in areas where conditions, though altered, still allow for survival. These pockets become the starting points for what will eventually follow, though the process of recovery lies far beyond the immediate aftermath. The world that emerges from this interval carries the imprint of profound reduction. The richness that once defined many environments is replaced by a more limited set of lineages, each shaped by the pressures they have endured. Life continues, but it does so within a framework that has been stripped back and redefined, carrying forward only those forms capable of existing within the constraints of a planet that has passed through one of its most severe transformations. Across wide stretches of the ocean, movement slowed into a kind of stillness that carried no sense of calm, only the absence of the exchanges that once sustained life. Water that had long supported layered systems of interaction became increasingly stratified, with surface and depth no longer mixing in the ways that distributed oxygen and nutrients. In these separated layers, conditions diverged, creating vast regions where the chemistry itself placed limits on what could continue. Near the surface, warmth lingered, but the balance of dissolved gases shifted. Deeper below, oxygen levels fell to near absence, forming zones where most organisms could no longer survive. These waters, deprived of circulation, accumulated compounds that further altered their chemistry, creating an environment that was both depleted and chemically unstable. The ocean, once connected through continuous movement, became partitioned into spaces that did not easily exchange what they held. Within this altered system, food chains began to collapse. Organisms that depended on steady flows of energy found those pathways disrupted as key species declined or disappeared. Producers at the base of the system struggled under changing conditions, reducing the energy available to those above. As these links weakened, the structure of the ecosystem lost cohesion, each level affected by the instability of the one beneath it. The loss did not occur evenly across all depths or regions. Areas closer to shore, where waters remained more dynamic, retained a degree of variability that prevented complete stagnation. Tides, temperature shifts, and interactions with the land introduced movement that, while unpredictable, allowed for intermittent renewal. In these spaces, conditions fluctuated, but they did not settle into the same prolonged depletion found in deeper, more isolated waters. Organisms that lived along or within the seafloor encountered a different set of challenges, yet in some cases, these challenges aligned more closely with the conditions that now prevailed. Bottom-dwelling creatures often interacted with sediments where oxygen levels could vary naturally, and where food sources were less dependent on stable, continuous flows. Their existence was already shaped by environments that changed over short intervals, preparing them, in subtle ways, for broader disruptions. These forms of life did not escape the larger collapse, but their mode of survival required less reliance on the systems that were failing. They moved slowly, conserved energy, and made use of resources that remained available even as larger networks broke apart. Their relationship with the environment was less tied to abundance and more to persistence, allowing them to endure within the narrowing margins of habitability. Along shallow coastal zones, early ancestors of horseshoe crabs continued to exist within this shifting boundary between land and sea. These regions, though far from stable, maintained a degree of exchange that prevented complete chemical stagnation. The organisms inhabiting them navigated fluctuations in temperature, salinity, and oxygen, conditions that varied across daily and seasonal cycles. Within this variability, survival was not dependent on consistency, but on the ability to remain within a range that continued to shift. The oceans of this time did not support the same richness that had existed before. They carried fewer interactions, fewer layers of connection, and fewer pathways for energy to move through. Yet within this reduced system, certain forms persisted, not through dominance, but through alignment with conditions that had become less forgiving. Their presence marked a continuity that extended quietly through a period when much of the living world could no longer sustain itself in the same way. Time stretches outward in the aftermath, not marked by sudden renewal, but by long intervals where change unfolds almost imperceptibly. The Great Reduction has already passed, leaving behind a world where life persists in scattered remnants. What remains does not rush forward to reclaim what was lost. Instead, it lingers within limited spaces, gradually expanding as conditions begin, slowly, to stabilize. The recovery following the Permian extinction extends across millions of years, far longer than the interval of collapse itself. In these early stages, the number of surviving species is small, and the interactions between them are simple compared to what existed before. Entire roles within ecosystems remain unfilled, creating gaps that persist for long stretches of time. Life does not immediately reassemble into complex networks, but begins from a reduced foundation, building outward with careful, incremental steps. From this narrow pool of survivors, new species begin to emerge. Evolution continues its quiet work, not through rapid bursts, but through gradual divergence as populations adapt to the altered conditions around them. These new forms are shaped by the limitations they inherit, carrying forward traits that allowed their ancestors to endure. In this way, the direction of life after the collapse is guided not only by opportunity, but by constraint as the past defines the range of what can develop. Ecosystems begin to take shape again, though their structure differs from those that once filled the oceans and land. The rebuilding process starts with simple associations, where a few species interact within limited networks. Over time, these interactions deepen, forming more layered systems that can support a greater variety of life. Yet this process remains uneven, with some regions developing more quickly while others lag behind, reflecting the uneven distribution of surviving lineages. Within this gradual return, certain organisms play a central role in shaping the emerging world. These survivor species, having endured the conditions of collapse, become the foundation upon which new ecosystems are built. Their presence stabilizes the environment in subtle ways, creating conditions that allow other forms of life to establish themselves. They do not dominate through complexity or speed, but through persistence, maintaining continuity where little else remains. As these species expand into available spaces, they begin to influence the structure of the ecosystems that follow. Their behaviors, interactions, and tolerances shape the conditions experienced by newly evolving forms, guiding the development of biodiversity along paths that reflect their own survival strategies. In this sense, the legacy of the extinction extends forward, embedded within the very fabric of the recovering world. The pace of this transformation remains measured, unfolding across spans of time that allow each layer of complexity to settle before another is added. There is no immediate return to the richness that once defined earlier periods. Instead, diversity increases gradually as new species arise and interactions become more intricate. The process reflects both loss and continuity, carrying forward what endured while reshaping it into new configurations. Over time, the world fills again with life, though it bears little resemblance to what came before. The ecosystems that emerge are not restorations, but new assemblies, built from the fragments that survived and the possibilities that followed. Within this slow return, life reestablishes itself, guided by the quiet influence of those that persisted through one of the most profound reductions in Earth's history. A new world begins to take shape on foundations that are still settling, where the surface carries traces of what was lost, and the living systems that return must adapt to conditions that have not yet stabilized. The Triassic period unfolds within this uncertain balance, a time when life expands again, though not with the density or structure that once defined earlier eras. The planet holds space for growth, yet the environment continues to shift in ways that prevent full continuity from taking hold. Across land, new forms begin to appear, emerging from lineages that endured the previous collapse. Among them are the earliest dinosaurs, small and often unassuming in comparison to what they will later become. Their presence marks the beginning of a lineage that will eventually rise to prominence. Yet, in this period, they remain part of a broader community of organisms, still competing for space and resources within an environment that offers no lasting stability. The climate during this time reflects the lingering effects of earlier disruptions. temperatures fluctuate across regions, and patterns of rainfall and dryness shift in ways that create uneven conditions across the landscape. Some areas support expanding ecosystems, while others remain sparse, shaped by extremes that limit the diversity of life. These variations prevent the formation of uniform environments, requiring organisms to navigate a world defined by inconsistency rather than predictability. Within the oceans, recovery continues at a measured pace. Marine ecosystems begin to rebuild, yet they remain less intricate than those that existed before. The interactions between species are still developing, forming layers of connection that are not yet deeply established. Life returns in waves, with certain groups expanding more quickly than others, while some regions remain relatively simple, reflecting the uneven distribution of survivors from earlier intervals. This period carries a sense of gradual assembly, where each component of the ecosystem forms in relation to the others without the guiding structure of long established systems. The absence of previous complexity allows for new arrangements to take shape, though these arrangements remain sensitive to ongoing environmental changes. Stability exists in moments, but it is not yet sustained across larger spans of time. Amid these shifting conditions, horseshoe crabs continue along a path that changes very little in outward form. Their presence extends through the Triassic seas with a consistency that contrasts with the transformations occurring around them. They inhabit coastal environments where variation is part of the daily rhythm, moving through spaces shaped by tides and shifting sediments. These conditions, already familiar to them, align with the broader instability of the period. Their way of life does not rely on the precise balance required by more specialized organisms. Instead, it reflects a compatibility with environments that fluctuate, allowing them to persist without significant alteration. While other lineages begin to diversify or adapt in response to new conditions, these creatures maintain a form and behavior that remains effective within the changing world. As the Triassic progresses, ecosystems continue to expand and reorganize, gradually increasing in diversity and complexity. The early presence of dinosaurs signals one direction in which life will evolve, while the persistence of older lineages reflects another. Together, these paths shape a world that is still in the process of becoming, where the future is not yet defined, and the present remains influenced by the echoes of a recent and profound transformation. The boundary between one era and the next does not arrive with a single signal, but with a series of changes that accumulate until the living world can no longer maintain its existing balance. Near the close of the Triassic, the planet enters another interval of strain, shaped once again by forces rising from deep within its crust. Vast volcanic provinces begin to open, releasing repeated flows of molten rock alongside enormous volumes of gas that drift into the atmosphere and remain there. As these emissions gather, the composition of the air shifts in ways that influence temperature across the globe. Carbon dioxide levels increase, trapping heat and altering climate patterns that had only recently begun to stabilize. The warming does not spread evenly, and its effects interact with other changes already underway, creating a landscape defined by rapid variation rather than steady conditions. Regions that had supported growing ecosystems begin to experience new extremes, while others fluctuate between states that offer little continuity for life to settle into. These shifts extend into the oceans, where temperature changes affect circulation and the distribution of dissolved gases. The balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide becomes uneven, placing additional strain on organisms that rely on stable conditions. Marine environments respond in layered ways, with some areas experiencing decline while others remain temporarily less affected, though few escape the broader transformation entirely. On land, the impact is reflected in the disappearance of many large species that had come to occupy prominent roles within their ecosystems. These organisms, often adapted to specific climatic ranges or ecological niches, find themselves unable to adjust as conditions shift more quickly than their structures allow. Their decline alters the structure of terrestrial communities, removing forms that once shaped the flow of energy and interaction across the landscape. This period, known as the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, marks another significant reduction in biodiversity, though not as extensive as earlier events. It unfolds through overlapping pressures rather than a single cause, with volcanic activity acting as a central driver that influences both atmosphere and ocean in connected ways. The result is a restructuring of life that favors certain lineages while diminishing others, creating a transition that reshapes the direction of evolution. Within this changing world, dinosaurs begin to expand into roles that had previously been occupied by other groups. Their rise is not the result of sudden superiority, but of alignment with the conditions that now prevail. As other large species decline, spaces within ecosystems become available, allowing these forms to spread and diversify. Over time, their presence becomes more pronounced, gradually establishing them as dominant within terrestrial environments. The transition does not erase all that came before, but it shifts the balance in ways that redefine which lineages will shape the future. The patterns of survival continue to reflect the influence of flexibility and tolerance, traits that allow certain organisms to persist as conditions fluctuate. Others, bound more closely to specific environments, fade from the record as the world moves beyond the limits they required. By the time the new era fully emerges, life has once again reorganized itself around a different set of dominant forms. The echoes of earlier ecosystems remain only in fragments, while the present reflects the outcome of pressures that have selected for those able to continue within a climate that has not yet settled into long-term stability. Across the land, movement takes on a new scale, where bodies grow larger and presence becomes more pronounced within the landscape. The age that follows is often defined by these forms, creatures that extend upward and outward, shaping the terrain through their size and the roles they occupy. Dinosaurs spread across continents, diversifying into a wide range of species that fill nearly every available niche on land, from towering herbivores to swift predators that move with precision through open ground and dense vegetation alike. Their dominance does not emerge from a single trait, but from a combination of adaptability, variation, and the opportunities created by earlier reductions in biodiversity. As ecosystems stabilize and expand, these organisms become central to the structure of terrestrial life, influencing patterns of movement, feeding, and interaction across vast regions. Their presence establishes a new rhythm on land, one defined by scale and visibility, where life becomes increasingly dynamic and interconnected. Within the oceans, a similar expansion unfolds, though expressed through different forms. Marine environments fill with large predators that navigate the water with speed and efficiency, occupying positions at the top of emerging food webs. These creatures, shaped by earlier cycles of loss and recovery, develop features suited to active pursuit and wide-ranging movement. The structure of marine ecosystems becomes more layered again, with multiple levels of interaction extending from small organisms to these dominant hunters. Yet even within this period of expansion and prominence, not all life follows the same path towards size and complexity. Along the margins of these systems, there remain forms that continue without significant alteration, existing within environments that are less defined by competition at the highest levels and more by consistency within local conditions. These organisms do not seek to dominate the broader landscape, but instead persist within spaces that offer continuity rather than constant escalation. Horseshoe crabs move through this era with a presence that is both steady and unobtrusive. Along coastlines, where land and sea meet in shifting boundaries, they continue to inhabit environments shaped by tides and sediments. These regions experience regular variation, yet this variation follows patterns that remain familiar over long spans of time. Within these conditions, their form and behavior remain effective, requiring little adjustment despite the broader transformations occurring across the planet. Their persistence reflects a different relationship with change, one that does not depend on expanding into new roles or increasing in complexity. Instead, it is grounded in maintaining compatibility with environments that retain a degree of continuity, even as surrounding systems grow more intricate. While larger organisms dominate open spaces and deeper waters, these quieter forms occupy edges and transitions where stability exists within fluctuation. The contrast between these paths does not create separation, but coexistence. The same world supports both the expansion of large, dynamic systems and the persistence of older, more stable forms. Each contributes to the broader structure of life, though in different ways and at different scales. The presence of ancient lineages within this evolving landscape serves as a reminder that not all survival depends on transformation. As this age unfolds, life reaches a level of diversity and interaction that builds upon earlier recoveries, yet it carries forward elements that remain unchanged. The giants that define the period move across land and sea, shaping the visible world, while quieter survivors continue along familiar paths, sustained by conditions that, despite everything, still allow them to endure. High above the surface, far beyond the reach of oceans and continents, a body moved along a path that had been set long before any living system on Earth could sense it. Its motion was steady, shaped by gravitational patterns that carried it inward over immense spans of time. By the moment it entered the atmosphere, the trajectory was no longer adjustable. The descent was direct, compressing distance into seconds as it approached the planet with a force that would alter everything below. Around 66 million years ago, this object struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, forming the structure known as the Chicxulub crater. The impact released an immense amount of energy, sending shock waves through the crust and displacing vast quantities of material into the atmosphere. Rock and debris were ejected outward, rising high before falling back across the surface, carrying heat that ignited widespread fires. These events unfolded rapidly, yet their effects extended far beyond the initial moment. As material settled into the upper atmosphere, it formed a layer that limited the passage of sunlight. This reduction in incoming light altered conditions across the planet, disrupting processes that depended on consistent solar energy. Temperatures began to shift, moving toward cooling as the atmosphere reflected and absorbed incoming radiation. The balance between light and heat, which had supported stable ecosystems, became uneven, affecting both land and ocean environments. Within the oceans, the reduction in light influenced the base of the food chain. Organisms that relied on photosynthesis experienced a decline in activity, reducing the energy available to higher levels. This effect moved upward through marine ecosystems, weakening connections that had supported complex interactions. As these links diminished, Larger organisms that depended on steady food sources found fewer resources available, placing them under increasing strain. On land, similar disruptions unfolded as plant life responded to reduced sunlight and changing temperatures. The decline in primary producers affected herbivorous species, which in turn influenced those that depended on them. The structure of terrestrial ecosystems began to fragment, with each level affected by the instability of the one below. This cascading effect reshaped the balance of life across wide regions, creating conditions that few species could navigate successfully. Dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial environments for millions of years, were among the groups most affected by these changes. Their decline was not instantaneous, but it followed the broader collapse of the systems that had supported them. As food sources diminished and environmental conditions shifted, many lineages were unable to persist. Over time, they disappeared from the record, marking the end of an era defined by their presence. The impact did not erase all life, but it reduced the diversity and complexity of ecosystems once again. Survivors remained within pockets where conditions, though altered, allowed for continuity. These forms would carry life forward into the next phase of recovery, shaping the direction of what would follow. In the aftermath, the planet entered another period of adjustment, where the immediate effects of the impact gradually gave way to longer term changes. The world that emerged from this event bore the imprint of both sudden disruption and extended transformation, carrying forward a reduced but enduring set of life that would once again begin to expand into the spaces left behind. In the first stretch of time after the impact, the planet does not settle into silence, but into a state where familiar processes continue in altered forms. The sky, still carrying fine particles, allows only limited light to pass through, shaping a dim and uneven day. Temperatures remain unsettled, shifting across regions as the atmosphere redistributes heat. The surface holds traces of the initial disturbance, yet the more enduring changes are those that affect the systems sustaining life beneath and within it. In the oceans, the disruption reaches quickly into the foundations of marine ecosystems. With reduced sunlight, photosynthetic organisms decline, limiting the primary source of energy that supports higher levels of life. This reduction does not remain confined to a single layer, but moves upward through the system, weakening connections between species that depend on steady input. Organisms that once thrived within stable networks encounter scarcity, and the structure of the ecosystem begins to fragment. Water conditions shift alongside these changes. Variations in temperature influence circulation, while chemical balances adjust in response to altered inputs from the atmosphere and land. In deeper regions, where renewal depends on consistent movement of oxygen, conditions become more difficult to sustain. Some areas experience reduced oxygen availability, while others face fluctuations that prevent long-term stability. These changes do not occur uniformly, but they spread across wide regions, shaping a marine environment that is less predictable than before. Amid this collapse, survival becomes closely tied to how organisms interact with variability. Species that depend on narrow conditions or stable food sources find fewer pathways to continue, while those capable of enduring fluctuations begin to persist within the shifting landscape. The difference is not always visible in outward form, but in how each organism manages energy, resources, and exposure to change. Shallow environments offer a distinct advantage during this time. Coastal waters, influenced by tides and proximity to land, continue to experience movement that introduces intermittent renewal. These areas do not escape disruption, but they avoid the prolonged stagnation that can develop in deeper, more isolated regions. Organisms living within these zones are already adapted to changing conditions, encountering variations in temperature, salinity, and oxygen as part of their regular existence. Flexibility becomes a defining factor. Species capable of utilizing a range of food sources, tolerating shifts in environmental conditions, or reducing their energy demands are more likely to persist through this interval. Their survival does not depend on the rapid return of stability, but on the ability to function within uncertainty. This capacity allows them to remain present even as broader systems continue to reorganize. Horseshoe crabs, already shaped by earlier cycles of disruption, continue to endure within these coastal environments. Their behavior aligns with the rhythms of shallow waters, where movement, sediment, and chemical variation are constant features. They feed on available resources without reliance on a single pathway, and their metabolic demands allow them to persist even when conditions become less favorable. Their survival reflects a continuity that extends through repeated disturbances, not through dramatic change, but through a sustained compatibility with environments that do not remain fixed. As ecosystems begin, slowly, to reorganize in the wake of the impact, these organisms remain within the shifting margins, carrying forward a presence that bridges the transition from one world to the next. There are forms in the fossil record that appear, persist, and then vanish, leaving behind a sequence of changes that trace the movement of evolution across time. Others follow a different pattern, where the outlines seen in ancient layers remain recognizable even after immense spans have passed. The horseshoe crab belongs to this quieter category, a lineage whose structure has shifted so little that specimens separated by hundreds of millions of years seem connected by more than ancestry alone. This continuity has led to the term living fossil, a phrase that reflects not a lack of life or activity, but a remarkable stability in form. The body plan, with its protective shell, segmented underside, and elongated tail spine, remains closely aligned with its early relatives. While subtle variations exist, the overall structure persists with an efficiency that has required little alteration. It is not frozen in time, but it has not been compelled to change in ways that reshape its identity. Evolution does not move with a constant pace or direction for every lineage. In some cases, rapid change occurs as organisms respond to new pressures or opportunities, leading to diversification and the emergence of new forms. In others, change slows, not because evolution has ceased, but because the existing structure continues to function effectively within the environments it encounters. When a form remains well suited to its conditions, the pressure to alter that form diminishes. For horseshoe crabs, this stability reflects a close alignment between body design and environment. Their structure supports a mode of life that interacts with sediments, shallow waters, and variable coastal conditions. These environments, though not static, maintain patterns of change that fall within ranges the organism can tolerate. As a result, the need for significant structural adaptation remains low, allowing the lineage to continue without dramatic shifts in form. The concept of evolutionary change often emphasizes transformation, yet persistence can be equally revealing. A species that undergoes little outward change across long spans of time demonstrates that its design meets the demands placed upon it with consistency. This does not imply perfection, but rather sufficiency, a balance between structure and environment that does not require continual modification to remain viable. Stability, in this sense, becomes a strategy shaped by compatibility. Instead of pursuing new forms or specialized roles, the organism maintains a relationship with its environment that accommodates variation without demanding constant adjustment. Its behavior, physiology, and structure work together to create a system that remains effective across changing conditions, provided those changes stay within certain bounds. This approach contrasts with lineages that evolve toward greater specialization, where success depends on finely tuned interactions with specific environments or resources. Such specialization can offer advantages in stable conditions, but it also introduces limitations when those conditions shift. In comparison, a stable, broadly compatible design allows for persistence through fluctuations that might challenge more narrowly adapted forms. The horseshoe crab's continued presence across deep time reflects this balance. It has not needed to transform in order to endure, because its existing structure remains aligned with the environments it inhabits. Through cycles of disruption and recovery, its form has carried forward, not as an unchanged relic, but as a living expression of a design that continues to function within the world as it is. Seen up close, the form reveals itself not through complexity, but through a clarity of structure where each part carries a direct and purposeful role. The body of the horseshoe crab is arranged in a way that appears almost elemental, a composition that has persisted not through elaboration, but through balance. A broad, curved shell covers the upper surface, smooth and protective, shielding the organism while allowing it to move across shifting ground beneath shallow water. Beneath this shell, the body is divided into sections that coordinate movement and interaction with the surrounding environment. The underside carries multiple appendages, each adapted for a specific function, from locomotion to feeding. These limbs work in a coordinated sequence, allowing the organism to navigate sediment, sift through material, and maintain stability within currents that move unpredictably along the coast. The arrangement is neither intricate nor minimal, but sufficient, reflecting a structure that meets the demands placed upon it without excess. Extending from the rear is the telson, a long, rigid spine that appears at first to serve as a simple extension of the body. Its function, however, lies in balance and orientation. When the organism is overturned by waves or shifting sediment, this structure allows it to return to its original position, restoring its alignment with the environment. It does not act as a weapon or a tool for active interaction, but as a means of maintaining continuity in movement and posture. Along the upper surface, a series of eyes are positioned in a way that provides awareness of light and motion without relying on detailed visual processing. These eyes are simple in construction, sensitive to changes in brightness and the movement of shadows, allowing the organism to detect shifts in its surroundings. Additional light-sensitive structures are distributed across the body, contributing to a perception that is diffuse rather than centralized. The world is not seen in sharp detail, but sensed through variations that signal the presence of change. Within the body, circulation is supported by a fluid that carries oxygen in a form distinct from that found in many other organisms. This blue blood, containing hemocyanin, binds oxygen using copper rather than iron, giving it a characteristic color when exposed. It moves through an open circulatory system, bathing tissues directly rather than traveling through a closed network of vessels. This arrangement supports a steady distribution of oxygen, aligned with a metabolism that does not require rapid or intense bursts of activity. Control of movement and response is managed without a centralized brain of the kind seen in mammals. Instead, a network of nerve structures coordinates behavior, allowing the organism to respond to stimuli in a manner that is effective within its environment. Signals travel through this system in patterns that guide motion, feeding, and orientation, creating a form of coordination that does not rely on complex processing or abstraction. Each of these elements contributes to a body that functions as an integrated whole, where simplicity does not imply limitation, but a refinement of what is necessary. The structure endures because it aligns with the conditions in which it exists, maintaining a balance between protection, movement, and perception. Through this arrangement, the organism continues to move through its environment with a consistency that reflects a design shaped not by constant change, but by the quiet persistence of what works. Perception, in this organism, unfolds without a single center where the world is gathered and interpreted, instead, emerging from a distributed awareness that arises across the surface of the body. Sensation does not collect into a unified image, but exists as a series of signals, each reflecting a change in light, movement, or chemistry, allowing the animal to remain attuned to its surroundings without relying on complex processing. Along the upper shell, clusters of light, sensitive organs respond to variations in brightness and shadow. These structures do not form detailed images, yet they provide a continuous sense of the shifting environment, registering the passage of light across water and the movement of objects nearby. Additional receptors extend beyond these primary eyes, scattered across the body in ways that broaden the range of detection. Together, they create a layered sensitivity where the organism responds not to precise forms, but to patterns of change that signal the presence of something moving within its environment. Beneath the surface, another form of perception unfolds through chemical detection. The surrounding water carries dissolved substances that indicate the presence of food, other organisms, or alterations in environmental conditions. Specialized receptors interact with these chemical signals, allowing the animal to follow gradients that lead toward or away from particular sources. This form of sensing operates continuously, guiding movement through a medium where visibility may be limited and where chemical traces provide reliable information over time. The integration of these signals occurs within a nervous system that remains simple in structure, yet effective in function. Instead of a centralized brain directing all activity, networks of nerve cells coordinate responses across the body. These networks process input in localized ways, allowing the organism to react to immediate conditions without requiring complex interpretation. Movement, feeding, and orientation emerge from these interactions, forming patterns of behavior that align with the environment in which the animal exists. Navigation, in this context, does not depend on mapping or memory in the way more complex organisms might rely upon. Instead, it arises from continuous adjustment to external signals. Changes in light guide orientation toward or away from certain conditions, while chemical cues direct movement along paths that lead to resources. Physical contact with the substrate provides additional feedback, informing the animal of its position relative to the seafloor and the shifting materials beneath it. This mode of sensing allows for a form of interaction that is both immediate and sustained. The organism does not need to anticipate or plan in order to move effectively through its environment. Its behavior emerges from the constant exchange between internal processes and external signals, creating a flow of action that remains aligned with current conditions. Each movement reflects a response to what is present rather than an attempt to predict what may come. Within this system, simplicity does not limit function, but shapes it into a form that remains reliable across changing circumstances. The absence of complex cognition does not prevent effective navigation, but instead removes the need for processes that might depend on stable environments or detailed information. What remains is a direct relationship with the surrounding world, guided by signals that are always available and by responses that are consistent in their application. Through this distributed awareness, the organism continues to move, feed, and orient itself within a shifting coastal environment, maintaining a steady interaction with conditions that change from moment to moment without requiring the structures associated with more elaborate forms of perception. Along the shifting boundary where water meets sediment, movement unfolds at a pace that mirrors the environment itself, steady, measured, and without urgency. The horseshoe crab advances across the seafloor with a rhythm that appears almost unchanging, each step guided by the coordinated motion of its limbs beneath the protective curve of its shell. There is no sudden acceleration, no abrupt redirection, only a continuous progression shaped by contact with the ground and the subtle forces moving through the surrounding water. This deliberate motion allows the organism to remain closely connected to the substrate it inhabits. As it moves, the limbs beneath its body press into the sand, pushing and pulling in a sequence that both propels it forward and maintains stability. The surface beneath is rarely still, shaped by currents and tides that shift grains of sediment from one place to another. Within this constant rearrangement, the animal adjusts its movement in response to texture and resistance, maintaining a steady course through terrain that changes beneath it. Burrowing forms a natural extension of this interaction with the seafloor. The body lowers into the sand with gradual pressure, allowing the organism to settle partially or completely beneath the surface. This action provides a form of shelter, reducing exposure to currents and potential threats, while also positioning the animal within a layer where food is often present. The process is not forceful, but guided by the same slow coordination that defines its movement, easing the body into the sediment rather than displacing it abruptly. Feeding occurs within this close relationship to the substrate. As the animal moves or remains partially buried, it encounters small organisms and organic material within the sand. Its appendages gather and direct these resources toward the mouth, processing what is available without the need for active pursuit. This method of feeding reflects a reliance on what the environment provides within immediate reach, rather than seeking out distant or unpredictable sources. The pace of these activities aligns with an energy strategy that emphasizes conservation over expenditure. Movement remains controlled and minimal, feeding is continuous but unhurried, and periods of stillness are as integral as motion. The organism does not depend on rapid bursts of activity or high metabolic output, instead, maintaining a balance that allows it to function effectively even when resources fluctuate. This energy-efficient approach becomes particularly important in environments where conditions are not always consistent. Variations in temperature, oxygen levels, and food availability occur across daily and seasonal cycles, and the ability to persist through these changes depends on reducing the demand placed on internal systems. By operating within a steady range of activity, the organism avoids the need for constant adjustment, allowing it to remain stable even as external conditions shift. Behavior, in this context, emerges as a direct expression of interaction with the environment rather than a series of complex decisions. Each movement, each pause, and each act of feeding reflects a response to immediate conditions, forming patterns that repeat with subtle variation over time. These patterns do not aim toward efficiency in the sense of speed or output, but toward continuity, ensuring that the organism remains aligned with the rhythms of the coastal world it inhabits. Through this steady presence, the horseshoe crab moves and feeds within a landscape that is always in motion, yet familiar in its cycles. Its behavior reflects an approach to survival that values persistence over intensity, allowing it to remain within environments that shift continuously without requiring dramatic change in how it lives. At certain intervals, guided by forces that extend beyond the immediate environment, a shift occurs in behavior that brings individuals together along the edges of land and sea. The timing of this movement follows a pattern linked to the lunar cycle, where the gravitational pull of the moon influences tides in ways that shape the conditions of coastal regions. As these cycles progress, the water rises higher along the shore, creating temporary spaces that are only accessible for brief periods. Within these intervals, horseshoe crabs begin to gather in large numbers, moving toward beaches where the tide has carried water farther inland than usual. The journey unfolds gradually, each individual responding to changes in light, water movement, and other environmental cues that signal the appropriate moment. There is no central coordination, yet the result is a convergence that appears unified, as if guided by a shared rhythm embedded within their biology. The beaches become sites of concentrated activity during these periods. Individuals arrive in overlapping waves, clustering along the shoreline where the conditions are most suitable. The movement remains deliberate, even within the density of the gathering, as each organism navigates through the shifting sand and the presence of others. The interaction is not chaotic, but structured by the same steady patterns that guide their behavior in less crowded conditions. Reproduction takes place within this narrow window, as females position themselves within the sand and deposit their eggs beneath the surface. Males, often attached or nearby, release sperm that fertilizes the eggs as they are laid. The sand provides a protective environment, covering the eggs and shielding them from immediate exposure. The placement within the substrate also positions them within a zone where moisture, temperature, and oxygen levels remain within ranges that support development. Each individual contributes to a process that, when viewed across the entire gathering, becomes one of the largest synchronized reproductive events in the natural world. The scale of these gatherings reflects not only the number of organisms involved, but the precision with which their timing aligns. The cycles of the moon, the rise and fall of tides, and the internal rhythms of the organisms converge to create a pattern that repeats with consistency over time. After the eggs are laid, the adults begin to disperse, returning to the waters from which they came. The beach, which briefly held a dense concentration of life, becomes quieter again as the tide recedes and the organisms move away. Beneath the surface, the eggs remain, embedded within the sand, where they will continue their development. The success of this reproductive strategy depends on the alignment between biological timing and environmental conditions. By synchronizing spawning with lunar cycles, the organisms ensure that their offspring are placed within an environment that supports survival during the earliest stages of life. The rising tide allows access to suitable areas, while the retreating water leaves the eggs in positions where they can develop without immediate disturbance. Through this repeating pattern, generation follows generation, each cycle contributing to the continuity of the species. The process does not rely on variation in form or behavior, but on the consistent interaction between organism and environment, where timing, movement, and placement align to sustain life within a world that continues to shift around them. Across cycles that repeat with quiet regularity, the movement of life settles into patterns that require little alteration, shaped not by sudden change, but by the steady return of familiar conditions. For the horseshoe crab, time unfolds through rhythms that align with the turning of tides, the progression of daylight, and the shifting of seasons, each interval guiding behavior in ways that remain consistent across long spans. On a daily scale, activity follows the rise and fall of water along the coast. As tides advance, the organism moves into newly covered areas, exploring spaces that briefly become accessible. When the water retreats, it withdraws or settles into the substrate, maintaining its position within the range where conditions remain suitable. This pattern repeats with a cadence tied to the natural oscillation of the ocean, creating a sequence of movement and stillness that reflects the environment rather than resisting it. Seasonal changes introduce broader shifts, yet even these variations fall within a range that does not require fundamental adjustment. Temperature, salinity, and resource availability fluctuate over the course of the year, but the organism's tolerance allows it to remain within these changes without altering its core behavior. Movements may become more or less frequent, and activity may shift in intensity, yet the underlying patterns remain intact, guided by the same principles that govern daily interaction with the environment. Behavior, in this context, appears predictable not because it is limited, but because it is well aligned with recurring conditions. Feeding, movement, and positioning within the habitat follow sequences that repeat with subtle variation, each action emerging from cues that remain consistent over time. There is no need to explore new strategies or develop complex responses when the environment itself provides a reliable framework within which to operate. This repetition reduces the necessity for continual adaptation. Instead of responding to each change as a novel challenge, the organism functions within a system where change is expected and accounted for within its existing structure. Its physiology and behavior accommodate variation without requiring transformation, allowing it to persist through cycles that might otherwise demand adjustment from more specialized forms. Stability, in this sense, becomes a defining feature of its existence. It is not a resistance to change, but an integration with patterns that repeat across multiple scales of time. The organism does not seek to innovate or expand beyond its established mode of life, but continues within a range that has proven sufficient across generations. This continuity allows it to remain present in environments that fluctuate without needing to reshape its identity in response. The result is a life that unfolds with a steady rhythm, where each cycle leads into the next without interruption. Movement aligns with tides, feeding follows availability, and seasonal shifts adjust the intensity of activity without altering its form. These patterns extend across long spans, carried forward through generations that inherit not only structure, but the same alignment with environmental cycles. Within this repetition, there is a quiet persistence, a way of existing that does not depend on constant change to remain viable. The organism continues within the boundaries set by its environment, maintaining a balance that allows it to endure through conditions that return again and again in forms that remain familiar enough to require no departure from what already works. In environments where conditions do not remain constant, survival often depends less on precision and more on range, the ability to function across variations rather than within a narrow set of circumstances. The horseshoe crab reflects this broader capacity, existing not as a specialist refined for a single niche, but as a generalist whose interactions with its surroundings extend across multiple conditions without requiring significant adjustment. Its approach to feeding illustrates this flexibility. Instead of relying on a specific prey or a limited set of resources, it consumes a variety of small organisms and organic material encountered within the substrate. This includes worms, small mollusks, and fragments of decaying matter, all gathered as it moves through the sand. Because its diet is not confined to a single source, fluctuations in the availability of any one resource do not disrupt its ability to sustain itself. The environment offers options, and the organism is equipped to make use of them as they appear. This adaptability extends beyond feeding into the conditions it can tolerate. Coastal environments are inherently variable, influenced by tides, weather patterns, and seasonal shifts that alter temperature, salinity, and oxygen levels. The horseshoe crab persists within these fluctuations, maintaining its internal balance across a range that would challenge more narrowly adapted species. Its physiology supports function within both cooler and warmer waters, as well as in areas where salinity may shift due to freshwater input or evaporation. Such tolerance reduces dependence on stable conditions, allowing the organism to remain present even as its surroundings change. It does not require a precise alignment of environmental factors to survive, but operates within broader margins where variation is expected rather than disruptive. This capacity becomes particularly important during periods of environmental stress, when conditions move beyond the limits that more specialized organisms can endure. Flexibility, in this context, is not expressed through rapid transformation, but through an existing compatibility with diverse conditions. The organism does not need to alter its structure or behavior significantly when faced with change, because its design already accommodates a range of possibilities. This reduces the need for adaptation in the traditional sense, allowing continuity across environments that shift over time. The advantage of this approach becomes more apparent when viewed across long intervals. As ecosystems change, whether gradually or through more abrupt transitions, generalist species maintain a presence by adjusting within their existing capabilities. They do not depend on the persistence of specific conditions or resources, and therefore remain less vulnerable to disruptions that remove or alter those elements. In contrast, species that rely on precise conditions may find themselves constrained when those conditions shift. Their specialization, while effective within stable environments, limits their ability to adjust beyond narrow boundaries. The generalist, by operating within a wider range, avoids this limitation, sustaining itself through variation rather than being defined by it. The horseshoe crab embodies this balance, moving through coastal systems that are never entirely constant, yet always within the range it can tolerate. Its continued presence reflects a strategy that values breadth over precision, allowing it to persist without requiring continual change. Through this flexibility, it maintains a steady existence within environments that evolve, shift, and repeat, carrying forward a form of life that remains aligned with the variability of the world it inhabits. At the margins of habitable space, where conditions press against the limits of what most organisms can endure, survival takes on a different character. It is no longer defined by abundance or stability, but by the capacity to remain functional as the environment shifts toward extremes. In these boundary zones, the horseshoe crab continues to exist, occupying spaces that challenge many other forms of life. One of the defining features of these environments is the variation in oxygen availability. In coastal sediments and shallow waters, oxygen levels can fluctuate over short intervals, influenced by temperature, organic activity, and the movement of water. At times, these levels drop significantly, creating conditions that would restrict or eliminate species dependent on steady oxygen supply. The horseshoe crab persists within this variability, supported by physiological systems that allow it to tolerate periods of reduced oxygen without immediate failure. This tolerance does not eliminate the challenge, but it extends the range within which the organism can continue to function. Its circulatory system, along with a metabolism that does not demand rapid energy turnover, allows it to operate under conditions that would place strain on more active or specialized species. By maintaining a lower baseline requirement, it reduces dependence on consistent oxygen availability, allowing it to persist through fluctuations that might otherwise interrupt its survival. The coastal zones it inhabits amplify these challenges. These regions are shaped by tides, weather, and seasonal shifts, creating environments where temperature, salinity, and physical conditions change regularly. Water may recede, exposing the substrate to air, then return, altering chemical balances and physical structure. For many organisms, such variability requires precise adaptation or limits their ability to remain within these zones. For the horseshoe crab, these fluctuations form a familiar pattern, one that aligns with its existing capabilities. Resistance to environmental stress emerges not from a single trait, but from the interaction of multiple characteristics that together support persistence. Its protective shell offers stability against physical disturbance, while its behavior allows it to adjust position within the substrate to avoid more extreme conditions. Its feeding strategy does not depend on immediate abundance, enabling it to endure intervals where resources are limited. Each of these elements contributes to a broader capacity to withstand changes that might otherwise disrupt survival. In comparison, more specialized species often depend on narrower ranges of conditions where temperature, oxygen, or resource availability must remain within specific limits. When these limits are exceeded, the systems that support their survival begin to fail. Their specialization, effective within stable environments, becomes a constraint when conditions move beyond those boundaries. The horseshoe crab, by operating within a wider range, avoids this limitation, maintaining continuity where others cannot. Over extended periods, this difference accumulates. As environments shift, species that cannot adjust are gradually removed, while those capable of enduring variation continue to persist. The result is not a sudden dominance, but a steady presence that extends across cycles of change. The horseshoe crab remains within these shifting systems, not because it overcomes every challenge, but because it operates within conditions that include those challenges as part of its normal range. Through this capacity, it occupies spaces that remain accessible even when broader ecosystems contract or reorganize. Its survival reflects an alignment with environments that are inherently unstable, allowing it to continue where others, bound to narrower conditions, fall away over time. Complexity often carries an impression of advancement, a sense that greater intricacy leads to greater resilience. Yet across long spans of change, this relationship does not always hold. As systems grow more elaborate, they become increasingly dependent on the stability of the conditions that support them, forming connections that function well only within a narrow range of environmental balance. In specialized species, this dependency is particularly pronounced. Their structures and behaviors are refined to match specific conditions, allowing them to operate with efficiency when those conditions remain consistent. Feeding strategies may rely on particular resources, physiological processes may depend on stable temperature or chemistry, and interactions within ecosystems may require the presence of other species that fulfill precise roles. These alignments create systems that function smoothly within their intended environment, yet they also limit flexibility when that environment begins to shift. When conditions change beyond these limits, the same traits that once provided advantage become sources of constraint. A specialized organism cannot easily adjust to a different resource if its feeding structures are suited to only one type. It cannot tolerate broad variation if its internal systems are calibrated to narrow parameters. As a result, even moderate shifts can disrupt the balance that sustains it, leading to decline when adaptation cannot occur quickly enough. Complex systems extend this vulnerability beyond individual species into entire ecosystems. As interactions become more layered, the stability of the whole depends on the continuity of its parts. If one component is removed or altered, the effects can move through connected relationships, weakening structures that rely on those links. The more interconnected the system, the more pathways exist through which disruption can spread, creating a network where instability in one area influences many others. In contrast, simpler organisms operate with fewer dependencies. Their structures do not rely on highly specific conditions, and their interactions with the environment are often broader in scope. This does not imply a lack of function, but a different form of organization, one that reduces the number of points where failure can occur. With fewer requirements to maintain, these organisms can continue to function even as conditions shift, adapting within a wider range without needing to restructure their entire mode of existence. The horseshoe crab reflects this principle through its enduring presence across multiple environmental changes. Its body plan, behavior, and physiology form a system that does not depend on intricate specialization or tightly constrained interactions. Instead, it maintains a balance that accommodates variation, allowing it to persist where more complex forms might struggle to maintain their internal and external connections. This does not suggest that complexity is without value, but that its benefits are closely tied to the stability of the environment in which it develops. In periods where conditions remain relatively constant, complexity can lead to diversification and the emergence of new forms. Yet, when those conditions become unstable, the advantages of intricacy may give way to the resilience of simplicity. Across the history of life, these patterns repeat, revealing that evolution does not follow a single direction toward increasing complexity. It moves along multiple paths, shaped by the conditions that favor different strategies at different times. In some intervals, complexity expands, while in others, persistence arises from forms that remain structurally and functionally simple. Within this balance, survival is guided not by how advanced an organism becomes, but by how well it aligns with the changing world around it. Along present day shorelines, where waves continue their measured advance and retreat, the same form that once moved through ancient seas remains quietly in place. Horseshoe crabs still exist today, their presence extending into a world shaped by countless changes that have transformed nearly every other aspect of life. Their bodies, familiar in outline, continue to follow the contours of coastal environments, linking the present moment to intervals of time that reach far beyond immediate perception. They are found along coastlines around the world, occupying regions where shallow waters meet sand and sediment. From temperate shores to subtropical stretches, their distribution reflects an ability to persist across varied conditions that remain within the range they can tolerate. Each location differs in detail, shaped by local currents, temperatures, and seasonal patterns, yet the underlying structure of these environments provides a continuity that supports their continued existence. Within these modern ecosystems, the horseshoe crab does not stand apart as an isolated remnant, but functions as part of the living community. It interacts with other organisms through feeding, movement, and reproduction, contributing to the processes that shape coastal systems. Its presence influences sediment structure, redistributes organic material, and provides resources for other species that depend on it at different stages of their own life cycles. In this way, it remains integrated within the environments it inhabits, participating in patterns that extend beyond its own survival. The ecosystems that surround it have grown increasingly complex, filled with species that reflect long histories of diversification and adaptation. Fish, birds, and countless invertebrates move through these spaces, each carrying traits shaped by more recent evolutionary paths. Despite this, the horseshoe crab continues to operate within the same general framework that has supported it across earlier periods, maintaining behaviors and structures that remain effective within the present environment. This coexistence highlights a contrast between forms that have undergone significant transformation and those that have remained relatively unchanged. Highly evolved species, with specialized features and intricate interactions, share the same spaces as an organism whose design reflects a far older pattern. The difference does not create separation, but rather a layering of life where multiple evolutionary strategies persist together. The continued presence of the horseshoe crab suggests that its design remains aligned with the conditions of modern coastal systems. While environments have shifted in countless ways, the fundamental characteristics of shallow shorelines, fluctuating tides, and sediment rich habitats provide a continuity that supports its way of life. Its tolerance for variation allows it to remain within these systems even as other species adjust, expand, or decline. Within this modern context, the horseshoe crab does not represent a relic disconnected from the present, but a living participant in contemporary ecosystems. Its persistence reflects not an absence of change, but a stability that remains compatible with ongoing transformation. The same qualities that allowed it to endure past disruptions continue to support its presence today, linking the ancient and the modern through a form that has carried forward without the need for reinvention. As coastal environments continue their cycles of movement and variation, the horseshoe crab remains within them, moving through familiar patterns that have persisted across immense spans of time, maintaining a steady presence within a world that continues to evolve around it. In laboratories far removed from tidal shores, a substance drawn from an ancient organism has become part of a system that supports modern medicine in ways that are not immediately visible. The blood of the horseshoe crab, carrying its distinctive blue color, contains a compound that reacts to the presence of bacterial endotoxins. This reaction forms the basis of the limulus amebocyte lysate, often referred to as the LAL test, a method used to ensure that medical products remain free from harmful contamination. The function of this system lies in its sensitivity. When exposed to certain bacterial components, the blood forms a clot, signaling the presence of substances that could cause severe reactions if introduced into the human body. This property allows scientists to test vaccines, intravenous drugs, and medical devices, confirming that they meet safety standards before they are used. The process does not rely on complex machinery alone, but on a biological response that has been refined through the organism's own evolutionary history. Within this context, the horseshoe crab becomes connected to a network of practices that extend beyond its natural habitat. Its blood is collected in controlled settings, where a portion is drawn and later returned to the animal. The extracted material is then processed into a reagent that can be used repeatedly in laboratory environments. This connection links coastal ecosystems to medical systems, creating an interaction that bridges environments separated by both distance and function. The importance of this process becomes evident in its role within vaccine safety. Before vaccines are distributed, they must be tested to ensure that no bacterial contamination is present. The LAL test provides a reliable method for detecting these substances at very low concentrations, contributing to the safety of treatments used on a global scale. In this way, The biological characteristics of the horseshoe crab support a process that affects human health across diverse populations. At the same time, this relationship introduces concerns that extend beyond the immediate benefits. The collection of horseshoe crab blood, along with other human activities affecting coastal habitats, has led to increased attention on the need for conservation. While many individuals survive the collection process, some do not, and repeated harvesting can influence population levels over time. These effects are not always immediately visible, but they accumulate, shaping the long term presence of the species within its natural environment. Efforts to address these concerns have begun to develop, alongside the continued use of the LAL test. Researchers explore alternative methods that could reduce reliance on natural extraction, while conservation initiatives focus on protecting habitats and regulating harvesting practices. These approaches aim to balance the value derived from the species with the need to ensure its continued survival within the ecosystems it inhabits. The connection between the horseshoe crab and human systems reflects a broader pattern where ancient biological traits find relevance within modern contexts. Its blood, shaped by conditions that long predate human activity, now serves a role within contemporary science. At the same time, this role introduces responsibilities that extend back toward the organism itself, requiring consideration of how its continued presence can be sustained. Through this interaction, the horseshoe crab occupies a position that is both ecological and functional, linking the processes of natural environments with those of human design and continuing to influence systems that reach far beyond the shores where it lives. Along many coastlines, the conditions that once remained within familiar ranges have begun to shift in ways that do not follow the patterns of earlier cycles. The changes are not always abrupt, yet they accumulate, altering the structure of habitats that have supported long continuity. For the horseshoe crab, these emerging pressures differ from the environmental fluctuations it has endured across deep time, introducing forms of disruption that arise from sources beyond natural variation. Habitat loss forms one of the most immediate of these pressures. Coastal regions, where land meets water in dynamic balance, are increasingly shaped by human development. Shorelines are altered through construction, dredging, and the reinforcement of coastal edges, reducing the extent of sandy beaches and shallow environments that support key stages of the organism's life. These modifications do not always remove habitat entirely, but they fragment it, limiting access to the spaces where essential behaviors, such as spawning, can occur. At the same time, direct harvesting has introduced additional strain. Horseshoe crabs are collected for various purposes, including use as bait in certain fisheries and as a source of biological material. While regulated practices aim to manage this activity, the removal of individuals from the population alters the balance that has been maintained through natural cycles. Over time, these reductions can influence the number of organisms available to sustain future generations, particularly when combined with other pressures affecting their environment. Climate change adds another layer of complexity to these shifts. Rising sea levels gradually reshape coastlines, submerging some areas while altering the position of others. Temperature changes influence the timing of seasonal patterns, affecting the alignment between environmental cues and biological processes. Variations in salinity and increased frequency of extreme weather events further modify the conditions within coastal zones, creating environments that may move beyond the ranges the species has historically tolerated. These changes do not occur in isolation, but interact in ways that compound their effects. A coastline altered by development may also be more vulnerable to rising sea levels, while populations reduced by harvesting may find it more difficult to recover when habitat becomes limited. The combined influence of these factors creates a context in which the long standing balance between organism and environment becomes more difficult to maintain. In some regions, these pressures have begun to reflect in declining populations. The reduction is not uniform across all areas, but it is noticeable in places where multiple stressors converge. The patterns of movement, reproduction, and survival that have persisted across earlier intervals now encounter conditions that differ not only in intensity but in type, presenting challenges that do not follow the cycles that shaped the species over time. The resilience that has supported the horseshoe crab across past disruptions remains present, yet it is now tested against changes that originate from processes unlike those it has previously encountered. Its ability to tolerate variation continues to provide a degree of stability, allowing it to persist where conditions remain within its range. However, as those conditions shift further, the margin within which it can operate begins to narrow. Within this evolving context, the future presence of the species becomes linked not only to natural processes, but to the ways in which these new pressures are managed. The continuity that has defined its history now exists within a world where the forces shaping its environment are increasingly influenced by external factors, creating a balance that is still in the process of being defined. Across the long passage of time traced through earlier moments, a pattern begins to settle into view, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual alignment of details that have been present all along. The survival of the horseshoe crab does not emerge from a single defining trait, nor from a dramatic transformation that sets it apart from all others. Instead, it reflects a quieter principle, one that moves beneath the surface of more visible changes. Intelligence, often regarded as a central advantage, does not appear as the guiding force in this continuity. The horseshoe crab does not rely on complex decision making or advanced cognition to navigate its environment. Its persistence unfolds through processes that do not require foresight or innovation, but instead depend on consistency in how it interacts with the conditions around it. This suggests that survival, in certain contexts, does not depend on increasing awareness or control, but on maintaining alignment with a range of conditions that remain accessible over time. Adaptability, in this sense, takes on a different form. It is not expressed through rapid change or the constant development of new traits, but through the capacity to function within variation without needing to transform. The organism does not shift its structure each time the environment alters. Instead, its existing design accommodates those shifts within limits that it can endure. This form of adaptability is less visible, yet it allows continuity across intervals that would disrupt more specialized systems. Stability, often overlooked in discussions of evolution, becomes a significant factor within this framework. While change drives diversification and the emergence of new forms, stability allows certain structures to persist when they remain compatible with the environment. The horseshoe crab embodies this balance, retaining a form that continues to operate effectively without requiring constant modification. In this way, stability does not oppose change, but exists alongside it, providing an alternative path through which survival can be maintained. The broader pattern that emerges suggests that evolution does not move toward a single destination. It does not consistently favor increasing complexity, nor does it always reward innovation. Instead, it follows multiple pathways, shaped by the conditions that prevail at different times. Some lineages expand through diversification and specialization, while others persist through continuity and tolerance. Both paths exist within the same system, each becoming more or less prominent depending on the environment. Within this balance, the survival of the horseshoe crab illustrates a form of success that is not defined by dominance or expansion. It does not replace other species or reshape entire ecosystems, yet it remains present across intervals that have removed countless others. Its continuity reflects a compatibility with changing conditions that allows it to persist without the need to outcompete or outgrow other forms of life. This perspective shifts the understanding of survival away from a single measure of advancement. It reveals a landscape where different strategies coexist, each aligned with specific conditions. In some cases, complexity and intelligence provide clear advantages, enabling rapid adaptation and the exploration of new environments. In others, simplicity and stability allow organisms to remain within familiar ranges, enduring changes that might otherwise lead to disruption. Through this lens, survival becomes less about reaching a particular level of development and more about maintaining a relationship with the environment that can endure over time. The horseshoe crab, moving steadily through its coastal habitats, continues to reflect this relationship, offering a view of life that persists not through transformation, but through a steady alignment with the world as it changes around it. At the edge of each passing age, where one world gives way to another, life does not move forward as a single uninterrupted line, but as a pattern of endings and returns. The surface of the planet shifts, climates change, and entire systems dissolve, yet within these cycles, something always remains. Not everything continues, and not everything is meant to. Some forms recede into absence, while others persist, carrying fragments of continuity across vast spans of time. Across these intervals, the contrast between disappearance and endurance becomes part of the larger rhythm that shapes life on Earth. Species that once filled entire environments can fade, leaving behind only traces in the record beneath the surface. Others, often less visible and less dominant, continue without drawing attention to themselves, moving through changing conditions with a steadiness that does not depend on control or expansion. Their presence does not interrupt the flow of change, but moves within it, maintaining a quiet continuity. The horseshoe crab stands within this pattern as a reflection of persistence that does not rely on transformation. Its form, carried across multiple extinctions and recoveries, remains aligned with environments that continue to exist in shifting forms. It does not represent resistance in the sense of opposing change, but rather a compatibility with it, allowing it to remain present as the world reorganizes around it. In this way, it becomes part of the continuity that threads through cycles of disruption. Life, seen through this lens, does not move toward a final state of increasing complexity or control. Instead, it expands and contracts, diversifies and simplifies, following pathways shaped by the conditions of each era. Some lineages grow more intricate, developing specialized traits that allow them to thrive within stable systems. Others persist through broader tolerances, maintaining forms that can endure variation without requiring constant adaptation. Both paths exist within the same unfolding process, neither fully replacing the other. Within this balance, survival reveals itself as something that is not always dramatic or visible. It can occur without rapid change, without expansion, and without the features often associated with progress. It can take the form of continuity, of remaining within the shifting boundaries of an environment that never fully settles. The horseshoe crab, moving through its familiar coastal spaces, reflects this form of survival, one that unfolds quietly across time. As the story settles into its final moments, the broader pattern remains open, extending beyond any single species or era. The cycles of loss and renewal continue, shaping the presence of life in ways that are not always immediately apparent. What endures does so not by following a single rule, but by aligning with conditions that allow it to remain. If this journey through deep time has revealed anything, it is that survival can take many forms, and that persistence often emerges in ways that are easy to overlook. Share what stood out most to you along the way, and how this perspective shifts the way you see life around you. There is always more to uncover within these quiet patterns, and more stories waiting within the long history of the world.